while the strikes undoubtedly were significant in disrupting those specific sites, there's also a question about the remaining ability that Iran still has to re-establish their nuclear program.
To me, the weakening of the regime is happening from within, even if from the outside it looks like the regime has survived.
Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. This week I'm in Jordan, so just across the Jordan Valley from one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world right now. After 2 weeks of conflict, a ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding, all the more as each side is claiming victory. President Donald Trump has said at the NATO summit that the US and Iran will hold talks next week. Meanwhile, one leaked US intelligence report suggested American strikes only delayed Iran's nuclear program by months, a claim the White House then rejected as flat out wrong, and more administration officials claim now more damage, just as the president said. I've come to the region to talk about the consequences of this conflict, talking to diplomats, officials, and local experts about the shifting dynamics on the ground. There is, I must say, a huge sense of uncertainty here. Sirens were sounding several times a morning or in the night to warn of debris from intercepted missiles coming from Iran. Around 8 people were injured in Jordan, but the damage goes much wider, particularly to tourism, which makes up about a quarter of the economy in a country which is stable but badly needs income, not least to cope with years of refugees. To help explore what's happening, I'm joined by 2 of my Chatham House colleagues who are in our London studio, Lina Khatib and Marian Mesmer. We're going to talk about the question of damage to Iran's nuclear program, all the counterclaims that are going on, what happens next, and the implications for the region. Marian, let me start with you. You're an expert in arms control and nuclear weapons policy with our international security program. And I want to begin with the military impact. The US strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure was dramatic. How effective was it?
Well, it's really hard to assess exactly how effective it's been without any readouts from the ground. And you mentioned in the introduction already that we have some claims and counterclaims as to how much damage was done. So what we do know from satellite imagery and aerial footage is that Israeli strikes already had done significant damage to any overground installations that existed. And then the US additionally targeted the nuclear sites at Natanz, which was an enrichment facility, at Fordo, which was also an enrichment facility, and at Isfahan, which was a research facility and a storage site. And so for the sites at Fordo and Natanz, the US used the so-called bunker buster bombs. The point of these bombs is that they can penetrate deep underground and then they set off a second explosion once they are about 60 meters underground, which is then meant to do additional damage to any underground facilities. They can be very effective, but they are also a well-known technology at this point, and there's some evidence that suggests that the Iranian government, when they constructed these underground facilities, used a layering technique by which you pour concrete and use additional softer material like different sand or different earth to create layers that could absorb any shocks, so thereby reducing the potential impact of any explosions. We've also seen from satellite imagery that the Iranian government sealed off the entrances to those facilities, which additionally would help with protecting some of the tunnels and some of the underground structures. And so because we essentially have these different assessments without the IAEA or any other impartial observer having been able to visit, it's really difficult to know exactly what has been damaged. And what I will also say at this point is that we know that the Iranian government had already alerted the IAEA to let them know that they were working on a new enrichment facility somewhere else, potentially under the Isfahan nuclear research and storage site. And so while the US targeted the 2 well-known enrichment sites, it's also actually very likely from the information that we have from the IAEA and from Iranian government itself that there is at least one more enrichment site that wouldn't previously have been targeted, that Iran was already working on, that could either already be ready for enrichment activities or might be ready quite soon. So I think just because of all these different facts, while the strikes undoubtedly were significant in disrupting those specific sites, there's also a question about the remaining ability that Iran still has to re-establish their nuclear program.
Lena, what do you make of this forest of claims and counterclaims? Israel saying lots of damage, Iran saying, yes, we have been damaged, and the US saying different things.
The traditional response by Iran and its proxies in confrontations with Israel has always been to declare victory. And this is very much in line with that line of behavior by the Iranian regime. They want to save face. They want to show that the American attack has done very little damage. And in fact, that was reflected in the speech that the supreme leader gave, in which he said, it was his first speech after the war, in which he said that the US failed to achieve anything significant in its attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel is also keen to tell the world that Israel was successful. He has also declared victory. And of course, President Donald Trump has said similar things about the US achieving its mission through its strikes on Iran. So you have the three actors wanting to show that they have not lost. So it's more of a war of narrative than an accurate reflection of military achievements on the ground.
If Iran says you haven't done very much damage, though you've done some, is that an invitation to be struck again? Is that a provocation?
It is a provocation if Iran follows up by actually doing something, such as launching missiles on US targets in the region once more, for example, or launching more attacks on Israel. But for the time being, it seems that President Trump and even Prime Minister Netanyahu are keeping a cool head about Iranian rhetoric. So it all depends on Iran's next moves. And what we can say for sure is that President Trump seems to be now saying to Iran, the ball is in your court diplomatically. There's meant to be a meeting between the US and Iran happening next week. In his speech after the NATO summit, or rather in his press remarks after the NATO summit, President Trump said that the US would not be rushing to sign an official agreement with Iran, but that he expects Iran to basically implicitly act in a way that's in accordance with the rules of the game set by the US. So now all eyes on Iran in terms of what the Ayatollah will do next.
So let's just go through this a little bit. I read the IA report. This is the report of the UN's nuclear watchdog, which inspects whether or not countries are complying with obligations on nuclear programs. And it produced this report about 2 weeks ago. And I was very struck by the way it said a long list of we don't know, saying that Iran had gone some way to pull out of something called the additional protocol, which is more intrusive inspections, and dismantle quite a bit of the monitoring equipment. And the IAEA saying we're actually not going to be able to reconstruct that continuity of observation. So we don't know where all this stuff is, though we found some of it in places that we didn't think. Marion, just take us, there's two lots of things people are after, aren't they, in assessing what's happened to the program. One is what's happened to the estimated 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran has already made. And the other one is what's happened to its ability to enrich uranium using these centrifuges.
Yeah, so the 400 kilogram of highly enriched uranium is essentially unaccounted for, not in the sense that it's lost, but just in the sense that we don't necessarily know where it is at the moment. It's highly likely that the Iranian government had already evacuated it from the facilities that were targeted in these strikes, and it is very likely safely kept somewhere else now. And so that means that in terms of Iran's breakout ability, so the ability how quickly Iran could construct a nuclear weapon, not much might have changed because they already had the uranium that was enriched to 60%. For weapons grade, you normally need a 90% enrichment. And I suppose what might also be interesting for our listeners is that uranium is enriched in cascades. So you would first enrich to 20%, then to 60%, and then to 90%. So if Iran has these 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% somewhere, they are essentially just one enrichment step away from having weapons-grade uranium.
Could they, in fact, make a nuclear weapon out of what they've got already, even if a rough one?
So not with the 60% enriched uranium. They would need to enrich to 90%. And the other thing is also that the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that they've got is roughly enough for 9 to 10 nuclear weapons. And if you look at strategic stockpiles around the world, 9 to 10 nuclear weapons is not really sufficient for a strategic stockpile. So it would mean that Iran has a nuclear weapon or 9 to 10 nuclear weapons. But in terms of their utility, that's really not that useful. So if Iran really wanted to pursue a nuclear weapons program, which I think also has to be said, they actually were hedging and got quite a lot of utility out of the hedging rather than the actual pursuit of a serious nuclear weapons program, then they would probably want to increase the stockpile of enriched uranium and also make sure that they have a good design for a nuclear warhead and all of these things. Because, of course, it's not enough just to have the highly enriched uranium. You also need a missile program so that you've got some sort of a way to deliver your warhead, which we know Iran has got. But you also need a warhead design. And we haven't really got any evidence that Iran already has a design for a warhead.
This is where some of the controversy about how advanced it is centres on, though a lot of people said yes, but they do have enough for a dirty bomb, something that could cause a lot of disruption. And obviously one nuclear weapon is enough to make your neighbours very, very worried.
I mean, sure, but also, I don't want to underestimate the damage that a dirty bomb could do at all. But, if you look at the damage that has been done to Iran over the last 2 weeks or so, if you imagine that Iran was to set off a dirty bomb in Israel or somewhere in the Middle East, I feel like the retribution would be so intense that my question is, what would be the motivation to do that? It would essentially be a death sentence for the existing government. And so, normally when we talk about dirty bombs, we are quite worried about terror attacks and sort of non-state groups that get a lot from the terror aspect of it, whereas I don't think that would really apply to the Iranian government or their intentions.
Okay, I'm going to come on in a second to the diplomacy, but we're not quite there because I just want to pin down what each of you thinks about this question of whether Iran may have retained enough knowledge and nuclear material now to progress towards a bomb. Marian, what do you think?
I think Iran definitely has retained enough knowledge. They have a very sophisticated nuclear engineering program, and while senior academics or senior scientists were killed in the Israeli strikes, I think the sort of academic structure and the scientific structures are robust enough that they would have a next generation sort of ready to move up and to follow on. That's often the most tricky bit to tackle when you're trying to design non-proliferation interventions, right? Because once the knowledge is attained, even if you get rid of all the technical aspects, you essentially have a generation or generations of people that have the skills and the knowledge to recreate a program if possible. So I think that's one aspect, right? And then given that we know that Iran has the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium somewhere, we know that those fissile materials are still in the country and that they could be used as part of a stockpile that could lead towards a nuclear weapon. Where I am a lot less sure is essentially the point on the warhead design. So I think, because in my assessment, because Iran was essentially hedging as to whether they wanted to follow through on actually developing a nuclear weapon or not, and they were getting a lot of utility from that hedging in terms of negotiations and so on, they might not have a fully fledged out nuclear warhead design.
Sure. Marian, can I just say, because there is a lot of controversy about that point. I mean, you said as a statement, look, Iran was hedging. And surely the point is we don't know. I'm thinking back to our London conference, our big annual conference last week with John Soares, who used to run MI6, saying, look, there's no reason they had this program if they weren't progressing towards a nuclear weapon. It's completely incompatible with a civil nuclear program, which needs only 3 to 4% enrichment and so on. So, this is a matter of debate. We don't know, do we, exactly whether they intended to take themselves to a threatening brink of a nuclear weapon or go all the way.
Yeah, of course. I don't know, and I don't have access to any classified intelligence assessments, so I'm completely lacking that side of things. But just in terms of the open source information that I've got and, looking at, for example, the fact that while the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was active, the nuclear program in Iran was essentially completely contained.
Yes, this is up to 2018 when Trump pulled the US out of it. Let me go to Lena. What do you think the incentives for Iran are now? Just on this question of, does it go for a weapon or not? Quite a few of the people I've talked to this week said they expected Iran to lay low, play at negotiations and emerge with a weapon.
What Iran wants right now is to save the ruling regime. This is the main priority. And this was again reflected in Khamenei's speech when he said that for Iran, the very notion of surrender is an insult. And here he was referring to the demand by President Trump regarding total surrender. So this tells us that ultimately, Iran is likely to use any diplomatic negotiations around nuclear weapons as a time-buying mechanism, so that it can use this time to recover militarily and politically and maybe to a certain extent economically, though that is a bit hard. And so for me, this kind of scenario means that Iran, under the current regime, is not likely to compromise that much. And if they have the opportunity to build a weapon in secret somewhere else, somewhere undetected, outside of these areas that were bombed by the US, then they will go for it and just use, as I said, diplomacy to buy time.
Is the regime fragile, or are people, Iranians, rallying around it?
I would say that those who were already supportive of the regime have hardened their support, but I wouldn't estimate that support has widened. And meanwhile, those who are against the regime are expressing this sentiment. However, this is very different from expecting a scenario of a popular uprising toppling the regime. I don't think such a scenario is likely at all. But one thing is clear. With the elimination of top commanders from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, with Iran's strategy that is based on nuclear weapons, the missile program, as well as proxies in the region having been failed on all those fronts so far, it is very difficult for the ruling regime in Iran to tell the Iranian people that the sacrifices those people were asked to make for almost half a century have been worth it. And so I feel that within the regime itself, some figures probably from the military will already be having these kinds of questions and questioning whether this rigid approach by the regime has actually yielded results. And to me, the weakening of the regime is happening from within, even if from the outside it looks like the regime has survived.
Really interesting point. And what about Israel at this point, Lena? What does Israel want? We know they want regime change, but what do you think their incentives are now about what to do next?
I think Israel is taking advantage of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to eliminate the threat of the Iranian regime. I think after the horrific attacks by Hamas of October 7, 2023, Israel has realized that it cannot coexist with this key source of destabilization that is the Iranian regime. And of course, the method used to eliminate this threat had to be gradual and also strategic. Eliminating the risk posed by the proxies first makes a lot of sense militarily for Israel. They have already largely achieved that, and this is when they then turn to attacking Iran itself. And now that Iran itself has been significantly weakened militarily, Israel can, go further in its pressure on Iran to perhaps accelerate this regime implosion from within scenario. I don't think this is a regime that can be toppled with external military action as such, but the more weakened from within it is, the more this works in Israel's favor, because the end game, I think, for Israel this time is eliminating Iranian threat once and for all, rather than coexisting with potentially threatening Iran, which had been the status quo for almost 5 decades.
Sure. All right, I'm going to come back to some of those points because they're crucial. But Marian, you were at the NATO summit only a few days ago, but it seems a very long time ago, given everything that's happened. What was the kind of talk about what next from the NATO members?
I think primarily European NATO members were trying to focus on Trump and how he was going to show up at the summit. And he mentioned Iran and the US military success as he saw it throughout any of his speeches, really. And Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, was very supportive there, and when asked about the legality of the US strikes, essentially confirmed that from a NATO perspective, the US had been in the right, and that NATO also had been opposed to Iran developing a nuclear weapons program. So the focus really was on Trump's big achievement and highlighting that. But European NATO members, besides focusing on President Trump and how he contributed to the summit, were just very laser focused on all the European security questions. So beyond the sort of US perspective on Iran, there wasn't that much discussion about what that means for Europe or what that means for the rest of NATO.
Yes, they've said, we're glad you did this to Israel. The world will be safer without an Iranian nuclear program, but urging diplomacy. And then, as you said, getting back to some of the European questions, including ones about money, which we're now very familiar with. So on to this question of what next and what next for the region. Lena, let me just, as I said, come back to this question for Iran, whether you think, and you were talking about Israel somehow perhaps provoking regime change, but from inside. Is that really something on the cards?
What is likely to happen is not mass demonstrations or an Iraq-style toppling of a regime. The more likely scenario is what I'd like to call an elite coup, which is military figures from inside the establishment in Iran getting together with some other political figures also from the establishment and taking advantage of the uncertainty regarding succession in Iran to push themselves forward to basically take over from clerical rule. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is 86. And although the Iranian authorities did claim that there is now a succession plan in place, nothing is really known about whether this is true or not, or if it is, then who the successors are. And as we saw in the case of Israel and Hezbollah, Israel assassinated the Secretary General of Hezbollah and his successor and his successor's successor. And so Iran currently will have looked at that scenario, and I'm pretty sure that the ruling Ayatollah in Iran must be concerned about his own safety in this kind of scenario. And this concern gives an opportunity to those more on the pragmatic side from within the establishment to take advantage further down the line and push themselves forward. This is, I think, a likelier scenario than seeing mass demonstrations in Iran or seeing an external power come and remove the Ayatollah by force.
Really, really interesting. What about Arab countries, neighbors to Israel and to Iran?
Arab countries have been worried about their own safety throughout this conflict. They don't want to be a target, and they have been calling persistently for de-escalation. They have extended a bridge, as the Saudis put it, to Iran. And yet we saw Iran hit a US base in Qatar. This will change public opinion inside Arab countries that perhaps had in a way put up with the destabilizing threat posed by Iran and now will be feeling that this regime is not to be trusted. And so I think they are unlikely to take any steps beyond calling for de-escalation and diplomacy, but deep down, I think they will be relieved if they see the regime in Iran significantly weakened or facing its demise.
They would be relieved to see the nuclear program disappear.
Absolutely, because this nuclear program has been a headache for Arab countries in general. And on this, they are aligned with the position of Israel and the United States. So the elimination of this nuclear program paves the way for a security alliance further down the line between Arab countries and Israel as well. And so for me, as an outside observer looking in, I see Iran's ballistic missile program having lost, by Israeli estimates, 2/3 of its missile launchers. And the estimate is that in this latest 12-day war, only 6% of Iran's missiles actually hit their targets inside Israel. So we can say that Iran's missile program has been largely diminished. Its nuclear program, obviously, despite the enriched uranium being unaccounted for, has been proven proven to be potentially not very effective. The proxies have been significantly defeated across the Middle East. So this is good news for the Arab countries that want this Iranian headache to be in a way dealt with so they can move on with their socioeconomic transformation programs, and also so they can move on with a new security landscape in the Middle East that sees the region move towards stability rather than constantly trying to anticipate threat from Iran and take steps that are preemptive in order to stave off this threat. And so this is where the Arab countries are.
As I was saying at the beginning, a huge desire from countries in the region, not just the one I'm in right now, but I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia too, to move on from the conflicts which just keep coming. Marian, let me ask you, though, about one of those conflicts which has not gone. Do you think that Israel's strike on Iran has distracted international attention from Israel's action in Gaza?
It seems that it has, because whenever there have been headlines over the last week coming out of Gaza, it sounds as if IDF action there has continued on and the humanitarian situation hasn't really improved. So I think that, unfortunately, remains to be resolved, and I'm not sure where the Israeli government stands on that at the moment. I mean, it seems perhaps that they are less interested in resolving that conflict, and perhaps maybe feel that they can carry on, especially while there's other things going on that take media attention off Gaza.
Do you feel that the UK, France and Germany are conflicted in a way? They were just getting to be very critical openly of Israel over Gaza particularly, but also over its actions in the West Bank, and moving very distinctly away from the US line on that, and now have been praising Israel, albeit in qualified terms, for attacking Iran's nuclear program.
It seems to me that is indeed a sort of a conflict for those countries, because they also had been trying, prior to the Israeli strikes against Iran's nuclear program, to come to a negotiated solution with Iran. And as that negotiation wasn't going as well as they would have wanted, and given that they are allies of Israel and usually tend to support Israel whenever Israel is in trouble in the region, they probably felt that they really needed to step up and support Israel in those matters.
It has been a distinct change. And Lena, if President Trump does meet Iranian representatives next week, what do you think may happen?
I don't have high expectations, because Iran is keen to show its supporters that it has not been defeated, that it has not compromised in the face of US pressure. Iran sees this as an existential moment, and therefore being seen to standing up for itself is a key priority for the regime, because it is concerned about this internal implosion that I spoke about earlier. And so I think, if anything, Iran will just be buying time in those talks.
We will see. We unfortunately can't buy any more time ourselves. We have come to the end of this episode of Independent Thinking, and I wanted to thank Marian Mezmer and Lena Khatib for sharing their insights, and to all of you for listening. I must say, just to repeat Lena's point, we feel intensely the desire of the region to move beyond these conflicts if possible, but it isn't yet. If you found this episode compelling, please do subscribe, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. We really appreciate it. Our producer is Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. Speak to you next week.